Welcome to the We as Nature podcast, where inspiring visionaries share their personal stories of living in alignment with the more than human world, and how this informs their unique contribution to cultivating a flourishing future for life on Earth. Each month, We as Nature features a new storyteller, sharing their experience of how listening to and learning from diverse forms of life has altered their course. The power of story lies within each of us, offering a portal to the language of the heart, connecting us to our feelings as a source of inspiration and courage from which we can act. For those of us seeking to create a flourishing world, starting right where we are, these We as Nature stories offer a space to listen, contemplate, and envision new possibilities. We as Nature is brought to you by Flourishing Diversity, and you can find out more about who we are and what we do at the end of the episode, as well as in the show notes. Today we are joined by KM Reyes, a National Geographic Explorer, conservation lobbyist and community organiser based on Palawan Island in the Philippines, where she is the co-founder and advisor of the Centre for Sustainability PH. The mission of this women and youth-led environmental NGO is to conserve the Philippines' remaining 3% of pristine rainforest through the establishment of legally protected areas. KM's work is driven by the belief that connecting communities with their surrounding environments forges the understanding needed to find sustainable solutions to our planet's greatest environmental challenges. Born in Australia to Filipino parents, KM lived and worked extensively in Europe, Latin America and North Africa before returning to her roots and settling in the Philippines. Her story is one of self-discovery through global exploration, whereby the experience of being lost and unsure of her place in the world took her on an unmapped journey that led to a clarity of purpose and a sense of belonging. We were deeply touched and inspired by KM's open-hearted story, where she takes us across the world with her before landing in the beauty and wonder of Palawan Island. We hope you enjoy the journey as much as we did. We'll now leave an intentional 10-second pause. This is an opportunity to settle into your surroundings, observe your breath, and become aware of your contact points with the chair or ground beneath you. Begin to drop your awareness from your mind down into your body as you move towards a space of listening.
It was funny because I was getting ready for this, thinking about my story and how I ended up pursuing this work of being a land conservationist, and then kind of taking it back to zero and realizing that it's quite ironic because I grew up in Australia to Filipino parents because of like various experiences that really marked me, namely racism. I grew up actually very disconnected to my land, and that happened firstly because I grew up in a big bad city, Sydney, in a very urban area, very commercial and very capitalist, for lack of a better word. I guess, kind of tracing out my journey, I realized that it's been this thing of like getting closer and closer to connecting to something. And I kind of didn't know what that was at the beginning. But I wanted to actually start about 3 things that really marked me growing up. I was raised by a single mum, and in an environment that was there was these kind of tinges of being Filipina and this Filipino culture kind of at the fringes, but English was pretty much my first language. I spoke a little bit of Filipino up until I was 3 years old. But English was very much my language, and there was food and so on, but I was very much, very typical I'm first generation Australian. So very much this story of trying to integrate into the culture of Australia. But there are 3 things that stood out to me, growing up, in my home. And The first thing was a little placard, like a little piece of wood that my mum had up on our wall. And it said that, the day we stop burning with love, people will die of the cold. So that was one thing. The other thing was my name. So KM, I'll cut the mystery straight away. So the kind of normal name that's on my passport is Karina May. But what it actually means is that my mother named me after the first ever youth organization in the Philippines that was really kind of outspoken about making change in the Philippines. That's called Kabataan Muna, which means youth first, and is also kind of an important thing for me to come back to, because officially this year I'm no longer youth by the UN standard. And so it's also this thing of like coming back to my name and realizing, okay, what does this mean? How do I serve in this new kind of role? And then the third thing that I've come back to a lot, and that's always kind of been there, and then it has come back again as an adult, is my mom has this painting that she did when she was like, I guess, so she immigrated during martial law. We had quite a tough dictatorship in the Philippines. So she migrated. She was very homesick, and she painted this like big painting, and it was basically these mountains, covered in clouds. And then in the corner is a woman in like, I guess, a nightie or like a white dress, kind of like gazing out into the distance. And when I asked Mom about it, she was like, oh, I kind of did that when I was homesick, but I never knew what it meant actually. Because, you know, I never went to the Philippines. Unfortunately, I came from a family that I think is unfortunate, that never really, never took me to the Philippines. And so I actually went on a whole other journey that I'm going to share with you before I even went to the Philippines for the first time. So I spent the first kind of 20 years of my life being really like, I'm Australian, and really raging against the machine of this thing of like, don't ask me where I'm really from. Don't ask me what I eat at home. Don't ask me like, you know, do I speak any other languages? It's like, just take me for what I sound like and not what I look like. And that's Australian. And so kind of, I guess, you know, going back to this question of like connecting, I guess my first kind of foray into that was dropping out of uni and pursuing yoga. And that was this first thing of like, because I was a teenager when that happened. And so it was this thing of like trying to connect to yourself. So there was that first, and kind of trying to make something of what am I? And then after that, like a very typical Australian, because when we're lost, we either finish high school, go traveling, and then go back to uni, or we finish high school, go to university, and then go traveling, or we finish high school, go to university, realize that we're lost, drop out, and then go traveling. So it's like one of the three. I was the third. From there, I went overseas, and it was super funny because, or, you know, serendipitous. So I ended up in Valencia in Spain. I ended up living there for a few years, for one reason or another. And then later on, I found out, you know, especially as part of this whole thing, my name is Reyes. So it's a very Spanish name. It comes from the colonial history that we have in the Philippines. And I found out that that the indecent friar, who is like my great-great-grandfather, was actually a Spanish friar from Valencia. So it's really funny that in this kind of search of like trying to figure out, you know, who or what I am, that I ended up living in this country that was actually kind of where I come from in this weird kind of way. But a really big part of what happened there was I learned a language. I kind of delved into Spanish. I became really obsessed about it, and studied it minutely. I got certified in it. But more than anything, it was this idea of like opening up doors to completely different mindsets. And I remember like once being on a train at the very beginning when I was still kind of learning Spanish. And and thinking, oh my gosh, every single person on this train is thinking in a completely different language from me. And I'm all kind of alone. And then as I got to learn the language, it became this thing of realizing how different we all are, and then how we're actually all the same. That happened. I kind of was still searching for a while until finally I ended up in Latin America, because I was like, I spent so long learning these languages, and now I want to use it for something that I really care about, you know? And it was funny because at the very beginning, I thought that I wanted to be like a fashion stylist. And then I thought that I wanted to be a yoga teacher. I didn't really know what I wanted. And then I ended up like waitressing in Paris. And the thing that I realized actually from waitressing in Paris, learning another language, learning a whole other culture, was that actually what I really loved doing was serving people. And whether that's food or in some other way. And also, I guess my mom is a journalist, and at the same time is also a community organizer in her own right. And I also, raging against the machine that I'm not a person of color, or I'm not Filipino, I was also like, I'm not going to be like my mother. I'm not going to be fighting for things. But, you know, your nature runs deep. And I grew up in this environment of, having to contribute in some way. And so finally I ended up in Latin America. And that was a real kind of turning point for me, because I realized that all of this theory that I put into learning all of these languages actually ended up opening all of these doors for me in terms of what I could do and who I could serve and who I could communicate with. And so I spent several years at that time, working in lots of different, this is when I really started change making. This is where I say that kind of my real change making, journey really began. And I was working in women's rights. I was working in housing tenure. But I was also always working in this very urban setting, because this is very used to, you know, what I am. I grew up as a city girl, and I felt most comfortable in cities. And I thought that I would always just want to be surrounded by people. And this is where I belonged. And a couple of interesting things happened during that time. When I was in Europe, I used to still get a lot of questions about, you know, where are you from? And, you know, I think especially in my experience, at least for many Europeans, where the environment is, or at that time was more homogenous, it was like they didn't understand that I would insist that I was Australian. And they were like, no, but like there's something else about you. Anyway, and so then when I went to Latin America, it ended up turning into this thing where I was working in these communities that were very closed. I was working in communities that were affected by narco trafficking. I was working in communities that were largely restricted to outsiders. And I had this weird pass that I realized that happened to me, because even though I was Australian, they accepted me because I was of color. And then for the first time ever, it became this thing of like, oh, wow, like being of color is not bad. And, you know, some really great things happen, and you connect with some really amazing people. And, you know, with that connection of having the language and having kind of the quote unquote right skin tone, I could do all of this kind of impactful work, and feel like that I wasn't an outsider, that, you know, and I did work alongside a few other Aussies and Europeans and Americans, and they didn't get that same treatment. And so I realized for the first time that, okay, like this is actually interesting. It'll get me somewhere. And it was during that time, I was living in, a community in a favela in Rio, and, we got really heavy rains. I was, living in like a very small tenement with some other colleagues from the favela who had a grassroots organization working with art. And I actually had this one artist friend who was a graffiti artist. And, you know, these areas that we're working in are just concrete jungles. And he would come out with his spray cans, and there'd be like a crack in the wall. And then coming out of the crack would be like a flower. He would like graffiti like a flower, or, you know, he would find an empty wall and he would graffiti a tree. And it was this weird thing of, even though he grew up in a very urban setting and, in a slum, basically, he was always looking for nature, and it just came out of him inherently through his art. But it was during that time that I there was a landslide, which was really, really scary. It happened on the other side of the community where I was working in. There was very, very heavy rains, and the entire other side of the mountain collapsed, and all of the families that were on that side of the mountain, a lot of houses were gone, a lot of people passed away. And it was around that time that I was doing a distance course. I'd finally decided that I was going to go back to university, and I was doing a distance course about environmental security. And it was this thing about talking about how we have all of these really big environmental problems that are happening, and the most vulnerable communities are always the ones that are marginalized, or the most vulnerable to these kinds of disasters are specifically those that are the most marginalized. And if you can imagine, I'm kind of in my little tenement studying this, and then on the other side of the mountain, by a stroke of luck, it wasn't my side, this is happening. There's like literally one side of the community that I live on that is losing everything, including their lives, because of this disaster. And so something really shifted at that moment. And I realized that it wasn't just about, I'd been working in human rights for such a long time, whether that was housing tenure or youth rights or women's rights. And I realized that actually none of those rights even matter if you don't have clean drinking water, and you don't have clean air, and you don't have stable land underneath you. And from that moment, I realized that, okay, if I'm really serious about wanting to serve people, then what I actually need to do is start doing it through an environmental lens. And so that's when everything shifted. I went into different kinds of environmental work. I was kind of jumping around. I finally went back to Australia, and it was like, after so many years of being abroad and so many years of facing this thing of being Australian but not, I kind of got back to Australia and realized, okay, so I'm actually lots of things and not just Australian. And that might actually be a good thing. And being able to speak other languages and being open to other cultures and diversity, because that's basically what it boiled down to for me. It was like I kind of negated the diversity in me. And then I ended up, without realizing it, kind of reaching out for these diverse spaces by learning other languages, by opening myself up to other cultures, that I was actually looking for diversity anyway, to kind of explain what this was, what I was. And so then from there, I decided it was time to go to the Philippines. I was ready. And that has been like going full circle, basically. I came back to the Philippines now 7 years ago, and I fell in with this wonderful group at the Center for Sustainability PH, who had this incredible dream to protect their land, their backyard, which is now Cleopatra's Needle. And it was the first time where I felt like I actually really was a bridge between something, because I was very much accepted in the work that I was doing because I was the right color and I had the right name. And because the Filipino diaspora is so big, there's not really a family in the Philippines that hasn't been touched by immigration, by overseas foreign workers, by the diaspora. And so it was really accepting. And for the first time, it was me kind of coming to a place where I was like, oh, I'm actually kind of connected to the land here. There's something here that I come from. I have a connection to this place. And it was really funny because I remember my first year, I was very Australian and very kind of international. And then this other side of me that I didn't know, all of these little things from habits of my aunts and uncles growing up in Australia, things that I'd seen around the dinner table, food that we'd eaten, that all of a sudden it all started connecting. And I started to realize, oh, okay, so there is this part of me that I actually do get some of this stuff. I am actually connected to this stuff. And then I remember this one time getting really annoyed with myself because I felt like I don't know, I stepped into a situation and I can't even remember exactly how it happened, but I didn't like my reaction, basically. I think my reaction was to polite, or, I grew up in this kind of very Western society where you speak out if something's wrong. And so I was in this situation where I wasn't happy with the way that I reacted. I guess it would have been a power dynamic, probably against an old man, because I work with a lot of old men, with politicians here. And a really close friend of mine that I met here said to me, yeah, but you have to remember that actually you are also Filipino. Like, you've spent basically your whole life negating the fact that you're Filipino, but now you're acting in this way and kind of acting toward these certain codes and norms because you are Filipino. And things also, I think, happen for a reason, because this specific friend, we found out we actually had connections like to our families, and she lived this whole life in Manila, which I actually think probably were the same age, which I think would have been my life had I stayed in the Philippines. And I think that it was, everything happens for a reason, but I really needed to meet her because I always wondered whether I would have these kinds of, and even now, like when I talk to her about like hating racism and getting really angry about, even like the Black Lives Matter, that really affected me. And she said to me, it's really funny because I don't understand at all kind of what you're talking about. I mean, I kind of do, but I don't really. And it was really interesting meeting her, and so important meeting her, because I realized that if it was like she answered the questions of what would have happened to me, what would I have looked like if I'd stayed in the Philippines, what kind of a person would I have been? So now I've been in the Philippines for 7 years. So now it's like, I don't know, I don't want to leave ever. I wanted to wrap it up by just kind of sharing where I live now. So I live on this island called Palawan. It's in far western Philippines. It's known as our country's last ecological frontier. It's basically paradise on earth. It's so far from city living in like commercial Sydney. So my whole family thinks it's really funny that I've ended up in this place. My partner, who's from Palawan, lives on this land. He is Indigenous. And we have this like really small bamboo hut that we live on the weekends. Monday to Friday, I'm in the city and doing stuff. But on the weekends, we go there, and we have this really funny bamboo hut that has like a door that you just kind of push out. And one morning I pushed out the door. It was just mountains and clouds and jungle. And what was so funny about it was that I turned into that woman in the painting I don't know why I'm getting so emotional about it now. Sorry. I've never shared this story. I guess that's why. But it was really funny that it all kind of came full circle, that I kind of jumped out of this bamboo house and then was peering out at this mountain and just feeling like there's nowhere else on earth that I want to be. And it was basically that painting that I grew up with. I'd kind of become that. So I'll leave it there.
A big thanks to KM, and thank you for listening. To find out more about the Centre for Sustainability PH, including what they do and how to donate, check out the links to their website in the show notes, where you can also find links to connect with KM via her social media channels. If you're listening to this episode in the first half of 2022, then KM is currently working on the Southeast Asia 30 by 30 campaign. Known globally as the Campaign for Nature, 30 by 30 is urging the world's government leaders to agree to protect at least 30% of the Earth's land and water forms by 2030. With the Philippines being 1 out of 17 of the world's mega-diverse countries on the planet, KM's focus is on getting their national government to commit to the 30 by 30 goal by upholding Indigenous rights and recognising local leadership. You can find out more about this campaign and the various ways to get involved, either as an individual or an organisation, in the show notes. If you were moved by this episode, please do help spread the word by sharing it with others who may find it interesting and inspiring. And if you're enjoying the We as Nature podcast as a whole, we'd be so grateful if you left us a review, as this is a brilliant way to help other people find the podcast. The We as Nature podcast is recorded live during an online gathering, where each month a new guest shares their story and attendees enjoy the opportunity to connect with other listeners. You can find a link to our upcoming We as Nature live events, which are free to attend, in the show notes. We as Nature is brought to you by Flourishing Diversity, an initiative bringing together voices from all over the world to explore humanity's interconnection with the lands, waters, forests, and fellow species. Flourishing Diversity is a path towards a vibrant future and offers a collective approach in response to climate breakdown and biodiversity loss. We create spaces to listen to and learn from all life, raise critical questions, search for alternative answers, and amplify generative biocultural practices. You can register to receive updates and inspiration from us at flourishingdiversity.com, as well as finding us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks for being here, and we hope you'll join us again soon.